Hello, it's Catherine and Max, and today we're going to talk about threats to biodiversity. But first, I have to show you how cute he is. Ugh, such a baby. So, last time we talked about what biodiversity is and how we measure it and why it's important to an ecosystem's stability. And today we're going to get into the threats of biodiversity. First of all, how do we know something is threatened? Well, there is a group. It is called the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and they have this thing called the Red List. It started in 1964, and the Red List is a way to track global status of conservation. There's 9 different categories. It goes from not evaluated, data deficient, so those two we don't know enough or we haven't even started to look, least concern, which is great, near threatened, vulnerable, those are like on their way. Then we have endangered, which we want to care about, critically endangered, which is very scary, and then extinct in the wild, followed by fully extinct. So extinct in the wild means that it's not found in nature anymore, but it might be found in zoos or in breeding programs. But it's functionally extinct. There's just a few individuals still holding on. Where are we at right now with the red list? Take a moment and check these numbers out. This is 28% of all species that we've looked at are threatened with extinction. So that's more than a quarter. Note the really high ones. We have amphibians. They're very vulnerable because everything goes right through their skin. Coral reefs and sharks and rays. Cycads, those special plants, they are very threatened. Let's look at a graphic depiction of our different organisms. So here we have different color bars. Green is good, that is least concern. Red is critically endangered, and orange is endangered. Yellow is vulnerable, but not the green yellow. The green yellow is not threatened. All right, feel free to pause the video if you want to look at this a little more in depth. What is causing all of this endangerment to our biodiversity? We have some categories of things that are threatening biodiversity, and they are exploitation, habitat fragmentation or degradation, habitat loss, so that it goes away. Those are two separate things. Climate change, invasive species, pollution, and disease. We're going to go through each of those. We'll start with exploitation. Exploitation is also called overexploitation. And when we think about fish, which is where we're going to focus a lot of our topic today, it is called overharvesting. What happens is enough individuals are removed from a population so that the population can no longer sustain itself, and that leads to population collapse. If you collapse a population in enough ecosystems, or if there is only one population, that leads to extinction. This is a major contributor to things like land-based species, such as poaching of ivory, and it's also a main driver of loss in marine ecosystems. We have looked at fish populations and found that 1/3 of them are overfished, and half of the others are fully fished, so we can't fish them anymore. For example, the bluefin tuna populations are down 96% and they're near collapse because it is a hugely popular fish. I have a video from the Monterey Bay aquarium to help us figure out what we can do about overexploitation. There's a app that they suggest to figure out whether or not the source of your fish is sustainable. I highly recommend checking it out. I use it and I'm a big consumer of fish. And so we can make choices in our daily purchases that can be more sustainable. And when I give you examples of like what we can do like this, please don't feel like I'm putting it on us. It is not the consumer specifically. Like we are not the sole source of drive for overfishing or overharvesting, but we can make a difference with how we purchase. Habitat fragmentation leads to a loss of biodiversity. And it does so because it breaks open habitats that could sustain more types of species. When this happens, we increase small pockets that are different from the original source. So here we can see this forested area all along the coastline, and then we have our habitat fragmented up for farming area. And so these little patches, they're going to have a slightly different type of species than would have existed into this large continuous habitat. We also have something called the edge effect, which we'll talk more about in a second. But here, there's a lot more edge than there is center in this habitat. This little string of trees is not going to be able to sustain the same species as this full continuous block of trees. We also increase metapopulations. That's the idea that some of the species that live in here and here and here could be similar, but now they're kind of broken up. And maybe they still interact, so they're meta, like continuing over, but they're not distinctly together anymore. So it fragments up the population as well. This also decreases habitat, so it decreases the population size. And if you decrease the habitat, you disrupt the trophic cascades. Here's the edge effect. I have a diagram. The edge effect is when you take an area that had a higher interior volume to surface for the edges, and you break it into little pieces. So now the volume to surface area is smaller, and here the volume to surface area is even smaller. We've talked about volume to surface area in cell biology, but that increases the outside of the habitat compared to the inside of the habitat. That means there's more wind, there's more light exposure, there's more temperature fluctuations, there's less protective area inside each of these patches because there's more edge. Here's another visual. We have an edge, and we can see a little wing coming off of it. These patches are going to be connected with a corridor, and each of these little patches is going to have a different type of habitat and a different type of microclimate compared to the habitat around it. So patch isolation separates those smaller populations from the larger populations. It reduces the animal's ability or the plant's ability to distribute itself, to move. It decreases biodiversity, and it changes all of those population dynamics, including food cycles and safe habitat for nesting or hunting. Here's a picture of our state. This is the Oregon coast. On the left, you can see Lincoln City. I love the visual of the habitat fragmentation and the patch isolation here. You can really see what we're doing. What's interesting to me is how wonderfully square some of these logging patches are. And it's really cool to get on a map where you can see who owns the land. And most of this land out here is owned by timber companies. But then we have this Valley of the Giants outstanding natural area that's fully protected. So this part here might have a more similar habitat to what used to be there historically, but it has been isolated from the rest of the population, and so it's changed. What lives there now is not the same as what lived there before. Habitat loss is when you fully remove the habitat as opposed to break it into pieces or kind of degrade it. This is done by logging, by burning, by clearing area for agriculture, and it also involves dredging, damming rivers, filling estuaries, building places where we can put humanity or put the things that we need to keep ourselves fed. This is a big effect of urbanization, but also mining for minerals and fuels. And so I have a picture here of Portland where you can see the Forest Park. And then on either side of Forest Park, we have our urban sprawl. So this is residential and this is industrial. And then we have our North Portland area. So you can really see that it used to be forested, it used to be green space, and we have changed it for our uses. And that's not to say that we should never build buildings, but it does affect the biodiversity. And so we have to think about it in terms of what we're doing to the other organisms on Earth. Deforestation, we expect that in about 100 years, there will be no more rainforests because we're cutting them down so quickly. We are losing 20 football fields every minute. And loss of rainforest not only destroys the organisms that live there, but it also contributes to 12 to 17% of global greenhouse gases. So that is a problem on itself. One of the main drivers in the areas where rainforest is clearing space for palm oil production. Palm oil is very desirable as a resource, and so we're just clearing area to plant palm oil trees. Another source of deforestation is our wood products. So the paper industry is the fourth largest producer of greenhouse gases. And of the timber harvested, 70% of paper is used by Europe, United States, and Japan alone, which is pretty incredible. We use a lot of that paper and that timber. We expect about 28,000 different species to become extinct in the next 25 years because of deforestation. So what can we do? We're going to always add things that we can do when we talk about these depressing ideas. And I have a video for you from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. It is Ants to Grizzlies, a general rule for saving biodiversity. Our next cause of loss of biodiversity is climate change. We're going to get into this in more details later in the term, but just as an overview, we have here on our y-axis carbon dioxide level in parts per million, and on our x-axis, years before today. And the longest ago is about 400,000 years, and then we get to zero, which is today. And this is a couple of years old, so it doesn't show you our current number of ppm carbon dioxide, but we have a different pattern, right? So it increases and decreases, but generally hasn't gone above 300 parts per million in the last 400,000 years. Then we have industrialization, that's about in the 1950s. And right here, we're actually up at, as of April 2026, we're at about 430. So we're right about here right now. So we're definitely causing a change, but we'll get into the data about what's happening and how it's happening and what we can do later in the term. There are effects right now that we can see with biodiversity. For example, we have range change. So grizzly bears have historically been up farther north than they used to be. And so here on this map, we have our polar bear habitat way far north. Then we have our historic grizzly bear habitat. And now this tan color is the extended grizzly bear habitat. So the grizzly bears are moving more north to try and get into cooler, less variable habitat, because the habitat here is changing and a lot more erratic than it historically used to be. And what does that mean? That means that when the two bears didn't used to meet, now the two bears are meeting, they're mingling, they're actually able to reproduce and have viable offspring. And so we're calling these new hybrids growler bears, which I think is hysterical. Another threat to biodiversity is invasive species. An invasive species is not native and added to an ecosystem, but it also has to create damage to that ecosystem. It has to harm its new ecosystem somehow. And this picture I have here is invasive garlic mustard. This grows in our area like crazy, and it's a major problem because it leaches chemicals into the soil to inhibit the growth of our native species. So it takes over habitats, and its seeds can sit for years, like hundreds of years, and be totally fine and sprout again. So it's really hard to get rid of. And those two things, not native, harming the environment, hard to get rid of, are pretty key about being an invasive species. In general, we have something called the 10% rule. Only 10% of non-natives can survive in a new place at all. And of those 10% that can survive, 10% will be invasive. So only 1% of all plants have the ability to do this, but 1% of all plants is a lot of plants. And so it is quite the problem. You watched a documentary about invasive species, or you will watch a documentary about invasive species specific to Oregon. But I also want you to think about other places invasive species And so this is invasive species of Guam, and it is fascinating. And that brings us to pollution. So pollution is anything that is harmful to living organisms, and it can be in the air, the water, or the soil. It comes from industrial pollutants, pharmaceutical drugs, agricultural runoff, eutrophication, which we're going to talk about in a second, and just garbage. Now, pollution is bad for us humans, but it's bad for everybody else as well. In the United States, we produce 268 million tons of waste per year, and the average American produces 4.5 pounds of trash per day, which is incredible. In the United States, 44% of all streams, 64% of all lakes, and 30% of all bays and estuaries are not clean enough to swim in. Not even like drink or like eat from, but to put your body in. So that's quite alarming. In some of the world's most polluted places, babies are born with birth defects, and the life expectancy of an adult can be 45 years because cancer and disease is that common because of the pollution. People that live in areas of really high air pollution have a 20% higher risk of death from lung cancer than people that live in less polluted areas. So these are drastic effects on humans. We also see effects on animals and wildlife. So in our water system, we have 783 million people worldwide who do not have clean water. That also includes plants and animals that are not counted in number. And 2.5 billion do not have access to adequate sanitation. There are about 8 billion people on Earth. So that is a lot of us. Over 1 million seabirds and 100,000 sea mammals are killed by pollution every year. Let's talk about eutrophication now. So eutrophication is a process. It starts with our agriculture. We're going to have a farm, and we are going to spray fertilizer on our farm. Fertilizer is something that helps plants grow. What it usually is something that contains nitrogen. Nitrogen is the limiting agent for plant growth, and so most of our fertilizers are just like a ton of nitrogen. Now, when you spray it on your plants or your field, it doesn't stay there, right? Because everything is connected. So it's going to rain, and that fertilizer is going to run off, or it's just going to leach through the soil. But either way, it doesn't stay here, and it ends up in our waterway. Now, our water contains algae. Algae are basically plants, and algae, they grow with fertilizer. So you're growing your algae, everything is getting super excited, and then that algae dies off. And as that algae dies off, we're going to have decomposers start to break it down. Those decomposers are going to be eating the dead algae, and as they eat it, they're sucking oxygen out of the water because they need that oxygen to decompose the dead algae. And that creates areas where there is not enough oxygen in the water to sustain life. And because of that, the fish suffocate. We call these dead zones. It looks like water, but there's no oxygen. And so things just suffocate. And it's because that algae, like the fertilizer, increased its population size and then crashed. Here is all of our suffocated spots. We have a couple things going on here to check out. Orange is eutrophication. So we're seeing a lot of growth in our algae because of those fertilizers. Red is hypoxic. Hypoxic means not enough oxygen, so we would call these our dead zones. And then green is areas in recovery. So we are learning, we are fixing things. We don't have to continue bad processes. So check it out, see how widely distributed these are, always on the coast because we're leaching into our water system. All right. I have a really fascinating TED Talk for you. It is called The Toxic Baby. The Toxic Baby is about atrazine, a chemical, and a frog researcher. So they are going to jointly tell you together. Here we have an artist. and they're going to discuss what is happening and also kind of make it a multimedia experience. It's a fascinating video. It's a little bit longer, it's 17 minutes, but it's wonderful. Highly recommended. Disease is our last killer of biodiversity. Heart disease is the leading cause of death in humans of all genders, of all races. It's heart disease. One person dies of heart disease every 34 seconds. And in 2023, which is some of the most recent full sets of data I could find, close to 1 million people died of heart disease. That's about 1 in every 3 deaths. And that's for the United States. I got this data from the CDC. What other diseases do we need to talk about? We have our leading causes of death in high-income countries in this table, this graph on the right, and we have the leading causes of death in low-income countries on the left. We have 2 data points. We have a white circle, which is the year 2000, and we have a gray circle, which is the year 2019. So in 2029, I will get another set of data, but this is the set that exists right now. Where does this data come from? This is from the World Health Organization, and we have our diseases classified based on non-communicable, which means not contagious, communicable, which is contagious. These are contagious diseases, and injuries. So please take a moment, compare the changes between the 2 countries and the 2 years. I hope you'll pause your video for this because there's a lot to take in. Some of the trends that I think are worth noting is the number of deaths. So we have different scale bars. We have in millions or in hundreds of thousands. And then the types of deaths. So in high-income countries, our top 5 are all non-communicable. So we have heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, stroke. Heart disease and stroke can go together. They're both cardiovascular, they're both blood pressure issues. Then we have types of cancers and another obstructive pulmonary disease, which could go into a basket with stroke and heart disease. And then if we look at low-income countries, the top 2 are communicable. Neonatal conditions, neonatal is very small infants, babies, and then lower respiratory infections are 1 and 2. These are treatable and preventable, and it would decrease the number of deaths if we had increased to medical access. Then we have ischemic heart disease. That's number 3, where it was number 1 for high-income countries. Number 4, stroke, which was number 3 for high-income countries. And then number 5, diarrheal diseases. That one is nice that it's been decreasing since the year 2000, but absolutely something that we could treat and prevent with clean water, with access to medical care. So these links of biodiversity, the threats to them, are also related to how people experience life and what kind of things that they have to put up with and what kind of things are killing us in different situations. So really fascinating. Disease doesn't only affect humans. We have starfish wasting disease, more appropriately called sea stars, sea star wasting disease. It happens sporadically. We don't know what's causing it. We have a lot of guess. It's causing mass die-offs, and it's just their bodies falling, like disintegrating apart. 40 different species so far have been affected by it, and it causes massive losses. So we don't know what's happening here. We need to be figuring it out because we need our sea stars because they are a keystone species. We also have sudden oak death. So disease affects plants as well. This sudden oak death is caused by a pathogen, and it's estimated to have killed over 1 million oaks in the last decade. That's only 10 years. When it gets into a place, it just goes right up under their bark and infects them, killing them. So we have a picture here showing us the sudden oak death in Alameda, California, which is in the Bay Area. We have white nose syndrome in bats. This is a type of fungus. It gets into their respiratory system and it grows hyphae into their respiratory system. That's what's causing it to be white and powdery. It's the fungus. We have seen 1 million bats die in North America in some sites when it gets into their nighttime hibernating area, like into their cave. It has killed off 90 to 100% of the population. So we are very concerned about bat longevity because of this disease. We also have chytridiomycosis. This is another fungal infection, and this fungal infection is taking out amphibians. So far, 30% of amphibians in the world are infected and leading to die-offs and extinctions. There is grave concern about the longevity of amphibians in general for the next couple of decades. So I know this is a little bit of a bummer, so I have a PSA from the 80s for you. I don't know if you remember the G.I. Joe PSAs, but the tagline was always knowing is half the battle. So now that we know what's going on, we know what we're doing, we can start looking for ways to take action and ways to educate ourselves and our families and our friends and trying to do better as we continue to grow and learn. And know that it's not on you. This is not a you problem, but every single person can have an impact and we can make a difference. And so it's not your fault, but we can take action. And so I find that really empowering and I think that's really exciting. And we'll continue talking about how we can take action, especially as we talk about climate change. I hope that was interesting and not too much of a bummer. Please email me with questions anytime, and we will talk soon. Bye.